In the middle of the city, far away from the noise of traffic and crowded streets, stood a mansion so big it almost looked like a small palace. Tall gates surrounded it, and the garden was filled with trimmed hedges, fountains, and flowers. From around the world, people who passed by always stopped to look, wondering what kind of life was lived inside. To most, it seemed like a dream, but for Daniel, the boy who lived there, it often felt like a golden cage. Daniel was the only son of one of the richest businessmen in the country. His father was known for his business empire, which stretched across continents. His mother was always graceful, elegant, and polite, moving through charity events and high society gatherings like she had been born for that life. But Daniel's life was different. From birth, he had a serious spinal condition that left him unable to walk. His wheelchair had become a part of him. Every day was shaped around what he could and could not do. Inside the mansion, nothing was missing. Every luxury a child could imagine was there. There was a room full of toys, a huge library with leather-bound books, a private cinema, and even an indoor pool. Yet Daniel rarely felt joy in these things. He had private tutors who taught him at home, doctors who visited regularly, and assistants who made sure he was never without help. But help was not what Daniel wanted all the time. He wanted freedom. His father loved him deeply, but showed it in the only way he knew, by giving him the best doctors, the most advanced equipment, and anything he asked for. But he was also distant, often busy with meetings, traveling to different countries, and rarely having time for slow conversations. His mother tried to be there more often, but she too had a schedule filled with events and responsibilities. Daniel never doubted that his parents cared, but the truth was, they didn't see the life he wanted. They only saw the life they thought he needed. The staff in the mansion were polite and kind, but they treated Daniel as if he was made of glass. If he dropped something, someone would rush to pick it up before he even had the chance to try. If he needed to move from his chair to the bed, they would lift him without asking. Even small things like opening a book or reaching for a pen were done for him. It was as if the whole house was built on the idea that Daniel should never struggle. For anything, it was on a quiet Tuesday morning when everything began to change. Daniel was in the library, reading about space exploration, when he heard voices in the hallway. A new maid was being introduced by the head butler. Her name was Grace. She was in her early 30s, with warm brown skin, kind eyes, and a smile that felt genuine. She was from a small rural town, far away from the city, and this was her first time working in a place as grand as the mansion. Grace greeted Daniel with a cheerful good morning the first time they met. But unlike the others, she didn't lower her voice or speak to him as if he were fragile. She simply smiled and said, "I'm Grace. I'll be working here now. If you need anything, just let me know." It wasn't the words themselves, but the way she said them, like she was speaking to any normal boy, not someone she needed to tiptoe around. Over the next few days, Grace worked quietly in the background, cleaning rooms, arranging flowers, and organizing shelves. Daniel noticed that she didn't hover over him the way the others did. She didn't rush to push his chair unless he asked, and she didn't fuss over every small movement he made. This small difference caught his attention. One afternoon, while she was dusting the shelves in the library, she noticed Daniel watching her. She smiled and asked, "Do you ever get tired of everyone doing everything for you?" Daniel blinked in surprise. No one had ever asked him that before. Usually, people assumed he wanted more help, not less. "Sometimes," he admitted. Grace tilted her head thoughtfully. Maybe we should change that," she said softly, almost as if thinking aloud. From that day, little changes began to happen. Grace would place books on the shelf just slightly out of his reach, encouraging him to stretch and grab them himself. When it was time to move from his chair to the bed, she would stand nearby instead of immediately lifting him, letting him try on his own first. At first, these changes felt strange. Daniel had grown used to people stepping in before he even thought about moving. But Grace's way felt different. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was that she believed he could do more than he thought. Daniel started to look forward to the times Grace would be around. She told him stories about her life in the countryside, about walking long distances to school, helping her family with farming, and caring for her younger brother, who had trouble walking after an accident. She explained how she had learned simple ways to help him build strength without expensive equipment, and how patience and small efforts had made a big difference for the first time in years. Daniel felt like someone saw him not as a patient or a delicate treasure, but as a person who could still grow, improve, and try. Grace never made a big deal about it, but Daniel could tell she believed in him in a way no one else in the house did. The mansion still looked the same from the outside, grand, perfect, untouchable. But for Daniel, something inside was beginning to shift. It was a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. Hope that maybe, just maybe, his life could be more than just waiting for others to move him from place to place. And though he didn't know it yet, this quiet change was only the beginning of something that would one day leave the entire family speechless. Grace settled into her new role in the mansion with quiet confidence. She wasn't the kind of person who tried to impress others with grand gestures. Instead, she worked steadily, paying attention to small details that most people overlooked. Daniel began to notice her patterns. In the mornings, she would hum softly while polishing the silverware or sweeping the hallway. She had a way of bringing a bit of life into the house, which often felt too silent despite all its beauty. What stood out most was that Grace never treated Daniel like someone who needed to be protected every second. She spoke to him like he was a normal young man. She laughed at his jokes, teased him gently, and listened when he talked about the books he loved. She didn't speak in a slow or careful tone like some people did, as though they were afraid he might break if they said the wrong thing. Her voice was warm but straightforward, and Daniel found that refreshing. One afternoon, Daniel was sitting in the library while Grace dusted the tall shelves. She noticed he was reading a large book about explorers and adventurers. "You like this stuff?" she asked, nodding toward the pages. "Yeah," Daniel replied. "I like reading about people who go places and do things I can't." Grace put the duster down for a moment and looked at him. Daniel frowned slightly, unsure how to answer. "Well, because of this," he said, tapping the side of his wheelchair. Grace didn't look away or offer pity. Instead, she gave a small smile. "You know, my younger brother couldn't walk after an accident. Everyone in our family treated him like he was fragile, but he hated it. One day he told me I'd rather try and fall than just sit here and do nothing." She picked up the duster again, continuing her work. "It made me realize that sometimes helping too much doesn't help at all." Daniel thought about her words long after she left the library. He'd never heard anyone talk about this in such a simple way. Everyone around him seemed to believe he needed to be protected, and he had started to believe it too. The next day, Daniel noticed a small change. When Grace came in to bring him a glass of water, she set it just slightly out of his reach. "You can grab it, right?" she said casually. Daniel hesitated but stretched his arm forward. It was harder than he expected, but he managed to take the glass without spilling it. Grace smiled. "See, no problem." And then on, Grace began adding these little challenges into his day. She would place his books on the far end of the table, so he had to push himself closer to get them. When it was time to move from his wheelchair to the sofa, she would wait, watching him try before stepping in to help. Sometimes he failed, and she would assist him without making a fuss. But other times he surprised himself with what he could. Daniel's nurse noticed these changes and didn't like them. He could hurt himself, the nurse warned Grace one morning. Grace just smiled politely and replied, "Or he could get stronger." The nurse shook her head, unconvinced, but Grace continued with her approach. It wasn't only about physical tasks. Grace also encouraged Daniel to think differently about himself. She asked him questions that no one else dared to ask. "What would you do if you could walk for just one day?" she asked one evening as she folded laundry.
"Oh, Daniel."
Daniel thought for a moment. "I'd go to the park and run until I couldn't breathe," he said with a small laugh. "Then I'd climb the tallest hill and look at the city from the top." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "Then maybe we should work toward that. Even if you can't run, maybe you can still stand on that hill one day." Daniel felt something stirring inside him. It wasn't that he suddenly believed he could run like other people, but Grace's words planted a seed, a quiet belief that his life didn't have to be as limited as he thought. Their daily routine slowly turned into something like a partnership. Grace would find new ways to make him use his body more. She once suggested he try a simple stretching exercise she had learned from her brother's rehab sessions. Daniel agreed, and though it was difficult at first, he noticed his arms and shoulders becoming stronger. Grace celebrated each small improvement as if it were a major victory. One rainy afternoon, the power went out in the mansion. Most of the staff hurried around, lighting candles and making sure everything was safe. Grace came into the library with a small lantern and set it on the table. She said with a grin. No TV, no computers. What do we do now? Daniel shrugged. Read, I guess? Grace shook her head. Nope, you're going to try something new today. She pulled a chair close and asked him to push himself from the wheelchair to the chair without her help. Took him 3 tries, but on the 4th, he managed to do it. Grace clapped softly. That's it. That's what I'm talking about. Daniel felt tired, but strangely proud. Over the weeks, Daniel noticed other changes too. He no longer waited for someone to hand him everything. He began moving his chair closer to shelves, reaching for his own things, and even wheeling himself to the kitchen for snacks. The staff noticed, and while some were surprised, others seemed almost unsure how to respond. They had spent years doing everything for him, and now he was doing more on his own. Grace never made a big announcement about what she was doing. She didn't tell his parents, and she didn't make Daniel feel like he was part of a special program. She simply treated him as someone capable of more than the world believed. One evening, as the sun set and the golden light filled the library, Daniel looked at Grace and asked, "Why are you helping me like this?" She smiled, sitting down across from him. "Because I know what it's like to have people decide for you what you can or can't do. I don't think anyone should live that way, not if they can help it." Daniel nodded slowly. He realized that Grace was more than just a maid in the house. She was becoming a friend, someone who believed in him without conditions. And though he didn't know it yet, the small changes she was making now would one day lead to the biggest surprise of his life. The weeks passed, and Daniel found himself looking forward to each day in a way he hadn't in years. Before Grace came into his life, mornings had felt slow and repetitive. He would wake up, be helped out of bed, eat breakfast that was already prepared, and spend most of his day reading or watching television. Now, things were different. There was a quiet excitement in his mind each morning because he knew Grace would find a way to challenge him. To make him try something new, it started with the smallest changes, reaching for his own books, moving himself between chairs, pushing his wheelchair a little farther without stopping. But over time, these tiny steps began to add up. Daniel noticed that his arms didn't get tired as quickly, and his back felt stronger. Even the nurse, who had been worried at first, began to admit that Daniel looked healthier. One sunny afternoon, Grace walked into the library carrying a tray with 2 glasses of fresh juice. She set one in front of him and said, "I think you're ready for something new." Daniel looked up from his book. "Something new?" She nodded, her eyes bright with energy. "I want to teach you a special way to try standing. Not the kind of thing doctors usually teach. I learned it watching people in my hometown." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The idea of standing was exciting but also scary. He had been told all his life that walking was impossible for him, that his legs would never support him. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" he asked quietly. Grace smiled. "We'll take it slowly. No pressure. I think you might surprise yourself." She wheeled him over to the edge of the large reading table. "Hold on to the table with both hands," she instructed. "We're not trying to walk. We're just practicing the feeling of putting weight on your legs." Daniel followed her instructions. His arm shook a little as he tried to lift himself, and his legs felt weak, almost numb. But Grace was calm, steadying him without doing the work for him. "Breathe," she said gently. "Don't rush it." It took several attempts, and his muscles ached. But for a brief moment, Daniel felt the soles of his feet pressing into the carpet. It was only for a second, but it was a second more than he had expected. When he sat back in his chair, Grace grinned. "That's the start. We'll build from here." They began doing these exercises almost every day. Sometimes, Daniel would only manage a few seconds of standing, but Grace celebrated each effort as if it were a huge achievement. She would say, "Every second you stand, you're telling your body it's stronger than it thinks." Those words stayed with him. Daniel also started noticing changes in the way he thought about himself. Before, he had quietly accepted the idea that he would never do certain things. Now, he began imagining possibilities, walking to the window without help, standing to greet someone, even taking a few steps across a room. These thoughts were still far away from reality, but they gave him something he hadn't felt before: hope with purpose. One rainy morning, Grace came in carrying a small wooden stool. "Today we're trying something different," she announced. She placed the stool in front of Daniel's chair and explained, "You'll use this as your support. It's lower than the table, so you'll have to use more of your legs to keep your balance." The first attempt was shaky. Daniel's arms strained and his knees trembled, but Grace stood close, ready to help if he lost his balance. "Don't think about falling," she said. "Think about standing taller." That simple sentence shifted something in his mind. On the second try, he managed to hold himself upright for nearly 5 seconds. Grace clapped her hands softly. 5 seconds. That's double yesterday. They kept track of his progress, not in charts or medical reports, but in simple, happy conversations. Grace would say, "Yesterday you did 5 seconds. Let's see if today we can do 6. Daniel began to look forward to these moments, and even when he felt tired, he didn't want to skip them. Outside of their practice sessions, Grace encouraged him to be more independent in everyday life. If he wanted a snack, she would suggest. He wheeled himself to the kitchen. If he wanted a book from a high shelf, she would hand him a reaching tool instead of getting it for him. Slowly, Daniel realized that he was relying less on the staff and more on his own abilities. One afternoon, while the rest of the staff was busy preparing for a dinner party, Grace and Daniel found themselves alone in the grand hallway. "I want to try something," Grace said, a mischievous smile on her face. She positioned him at one end of the hall and placed a sturdy chair halfway down. "Let's see if you can stand. Take one step toward the chair, and then sit down on it." "Be right here." Daniel hesitated. A step. That felt like more than he was ready for. But Grace's confidence in him was contagious. With her guidance, he stood up slowly, gripping her hand for balance. Then, focusing all his strength, he moved 1 foot forward. The motion was clumsy and unsteady, but it was still a step. He sank into the chair with a mix of exhaustion and pride. Grace beamed. "Daniel, do you realize what you just did? You took a step?" He laughed, breathless. "It felt more like falling forward." "Falling forward is still moving forward," she replied with a wink. From that day on, they practiced not just standing, but moving tiny, careful steps supported by furniture or Grace's steady hands. Daniel's legs remained weak, but each attempt felt like a small victory over years of limitations. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel's confidence grew. He no longer saw himself as just the boy in the wheelchair. He was becoming someone who could push his limits, even if progress came in inches. And though he hadn't told anyone else in the family, he began to dream of a moment when he could show them what he had been working toward. Grace never promised miracles. She never said, "One day you'll walk like everyone else."
How would she?
Did promise was that they would keep trying, no matter how slow the progress. And somehow that promise was enough to keep Daniel moving forward. Little did he know, the day when he would reveal his progress to the world was closer than he imagined. And when it came, it would leave everyone in the mansion speechless. The morning of Daniel's birthday arrived with a quiet excitement in the mansion. It wasn't just any birthday. It was his 18th, a milestone his parents wanted to celebrate in a grand way. The house was alive with activity from early. In the morning, staff moved quickly through the hallways, arranging flowers, setting tables, polishing silverware, and making sure every corner looked perfect. The dining hall was transformed into a space fit for a royal banquet, with chandeliers glowing softly, crystal glasses lined up neatly, and the aroma of freshly baked pastries drifting through the air. Daniel watched all this from his wheelchair, feeling a mix of emotions. Birthdays had always been bittersweet for him. The parties were grand, the guests well-dressed, and the gifts expensive, but they always followed the same pattern. People smiling politely, talking over him, and treating him with careful sympathy. He appreciated their kindness, but deep down, he wanted to be seen for who he was, not for what he couldn't do. This year, however, was different. For months, he had been secretly working with Grace, building his strength and balance. And today, he planned to show his parents and everyone else what he had achieved. Grace had been the one to suggest it. "You've worked hard for this moment," she told him the night before. "You don't have to make a speech. You just have to stand. Let them see you, really see you." As the afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, guests began arriving. The air was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of conversations. Business partners of his father, old friends of the family, and distant relatives filled the room. Daniel's father moved confidently among them, shaking hands and making introductions. While his mother floated gracefully, welcoming everyone with warmth, Daniel sat near the corner, watching the scene. His heart was beating faster than usual. Not from nervousness alone, but from anticipation. Grace stood nearby, blending in with the staff, her eyes meeting his now and then, as if to say, "You've got this." Finally, the moment came. The lights dimmed slightly, and the staff rolled out the large birthday cake. The guests gathered around, smiling and clapping, waiting for the candles to be lit. This was usually the moment when Daniel's chair would be wheeled forward so everyone could see him clearly as he made a wish. But this time, things would be different. Grace leaned down and whispered, "Ready?" Daniel nodded, his palms slightly damp. She wheeled him to the center of the room, then stepped back. The guests, expecting the usual scene, fell silent when they noticed Grace wasn't standing behind him anymore. Daniel placed his hands on the armrests of his wheelchair. His body trembled slightly, but he took a slow, deep breath. He could feel every pair of eyes in the room on him. Grace's voice echoed softly in his mind. "Don't think about falling. Think about standing taller." With steady determination, he pushed himself upward. At first, his knees felt weak, and for a brief second, he thought he might not make it. But then his muscles remembered the hours of practice. Slowly, he rose to his feet. The room was so quiet that the sound of his breath seemed loud. Gasps filled the air. His mother's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and tears. His father's expression froze, disbelief written all over his face. Daniel stood there, holding on to the edge of the table for balance. But he was standing, not sitting. The silence broke into a wave of applause and murmurs of amazement. Daniel's heart pounded with pride and relief. Dadna, but he wasn't finished. He shifted his weight carefully and took one slow, deliberate step forward toward his father. It wasn't smooth, and it wasn't quick, but it was a step. Then another. Each movement felt like climbing a mountain, but he kept going until he was close enough to wrap his arms around his father. For a moment, his father didn't move. Then, as if realizing this was real, he embraced Daniel tightly. "Son," was all he managed to say, his voice breaking. The applause around them grew louder, some guests even wiping away tears. Daniel's mother joined them, hugging both of them. At once, how did you?" she began, but Daniel just smiled and glanced at Grace, who stood in the background with a proud but humble smile. The rest of the party felt completely different from any Daniel had experienced before. People came up to him not with pity, but with genuine admiration. They asked about his progress, his training, his determination. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the boy in the wheelchair who had to be helped with everything. He was the young man who had stood up in front of everyone and walked toward his father. Grace stayed in the background, never drawing attention to herself. But Daniel knew, and his parents began to realize that she had played a huge part. In this transformation, his father approached her quietly during the evening. "What you've done for my son?" "There are no words," he said, his voice softer than usual. "If there's anything you want, anything at all, name it." Grace shook her head gently. "Just keep believing in him. That's all I ask." As the evening drew to a close, Daniel felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The months of effort, the small daily challenges, the moments of frustration, they had all led to this. He knew he still had a long way to go. But tonight had proven something important. He was capable of more than anyone, including himself, had believed. The guests eventually left, the music faded, and the grand hall grew quiet again. But the memory of what had happened would stay alive in that house forever. Daniel had taken his first steps, not just toward his father, but toward a future that suddenly felt much bigger than the walls of the mansion. And though he didn't say it aloud, he knew he owed it to the woman who had treated him not like a fragile heir, but like a young man who still had strength to discover. The day after the birthday celebration, the mansion felt strangely quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from an empty house. Staff were still going about their duties. The fountain outside still flowed, and the kitchen was still busy with breakfast preparations. But there was a new kind of calm in the air, as if everyone was still processing what they had witnessed the night before. Daniel woke up feeling both tired and light. At the same time, his legs ached from the effort of standing and walking those few steps, but his heart felt fuller than it ever had before. Lying in bed, he thought back to the moment when he hugged his father. He could still see the look on his parents' faces: surprise, pride, and a hint of guilt, as if they were realizing they had underestimated him for far too long. When he wheeled himself into the dining room for breakfast, his parents were already there. His mother smiled warmly. "Good morning, birthday boy," she said, her voice softer than usual. His father set down his coffee cup and looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Daniel, I'm proud of you. I don't think I've ever been more proud." Daniel felt a warmth spread through him. "Thanks, Dad," he replied quietly. His father cleared his throat. "I also need to thank Grace. She's clearly done something no one else could." Grace, who had just entered carrying a tray of toast, smiled politely but said nothing. She placed the food on the table and began pouring juice. Daniel glanced at her and gave a small smile of gratitude, one that said more than words ever could. The following week, the story of Daniel's birthday surprise spread quickly among family, friends, and eventually reached local media. Some articles were written about his determination, and a few even called it a miracle. But Daniel knew it wasn't magic. It was months of small steps, endless patience, and someone who believed in him when no one else dared to push him. Reporters wanted interviews, but Daniel only agreed to one, a short piece where he talked about the importance of not giving up on yourself. He didn't mention Grace by name, but he described a friend who treated me like a person, not a patient. Grace saw the interview on TV and smiled to herself. She never cared about recognition. Seeing Daniel stand was reward enough. In the weeks that followed, Daniel continued his practice. He didn't have to keep it a secret. His parents fully supported him, even hiring a physiotherapist to work alongside Grace's methods. Daniel insisted that Grace remain part of the routine. "She's the reason I started," he told them. "I want her with me until I reach my next goal." Grace agreed, but reminded him, "The work is still yours, Daniel. I can guide you, but you have to do the pushing." And push he did. Some days were hard. There were mornings when his legs felt weaker than the day before, when frustration threatened to undo his progress. But then he would remember the way he had stood in front of everyone on his birthday. The image would fuel him to try again. One sunny afternoon, months after the party, Daniel decided to visit the garden without his wheelchair for the first time. Grace was right beside him, holding his arm as he took careful steps along the stone path. The fresh air, the scent of blooming flowers, and the feel of the ground beneath his shoes made him smile. "Feels different standing here," he said, looking at the garden from a height he wasn't used to. Grace chuckled. "The world always looks different when you rise to meet it." That day marked a turning point. Walking short distances became part of his daily life. Still used the wheelchair for longer trips or when he felt tired, but now he had the choice. That choice made all the difference. Eventually, the time came for Grace to return to her hometown. Her mother's health had begun to decline, and she needed to be there to help. Daniel and his parents offered her anything she needed to stay: a higher salary, more time off, even a small house near the mansion. But Grace shook her head gently. "I have to go. My family needs me. But Daniel doesn't need me the way he used to. He's strong now, inside and out." The day she left, Daniel wheeled himself to the front gate to say goodbye. "You know," he said with a smile, "I'm going to prove you wrong. I still need you." Grace laughed softly. "Maybe, but now you know how to need yourself first." She hugged him, something she rarely did, and whispered, "Don't stop taking steps, no matter how small." After she was gone, the mansion felt different again. Not emptier, but wiser somehow. Daniel kept practicing, holding on to the lessons Grace had taught him, not just about standing and walking, but about believing in his own strength. His parents became more involved in his journey, often watching his exercises and cheering him on. A year later, Daniel traveled to Grace's hometown with his parents. By then, he could walk steadily for several minutes without support. He found her tending to her garden, wearing the same warm smile he remembered. "Told you I'd still need you," he said as he walked up to her. Grace's eyes glistened with pride. "And I told you not to stop. It's like you listened." They sat under the shade of a tree, talking about everything that had happened since they last saw each other. Grace admitted she had worried he might stop practicing after she left. Daniel shook his head. "You didn't just help me walk. You made me believe I was worth the effort." When it was time to leave, Daniel stood, hugged her once more, and promised to visit again. As he walked back to the car, he realized something: his life had truly changed forever. Not because he could walk now, but because he had learned to face his limits with courage and persistence. The mansion would always be a place of comfort and wealth. But it no longer felt like a cage. It was simply the starting point of a life he could shape for himself. And every time he took a step in the garden, in the city, or anywhere else, he carried with him the memory of the woman who had treated him not as a fragile boy, but as a young man with untapped strength. And so in his heart, every step was a thank you to Grace.